Hello. Welcome to this episode of A Creative Approach podcast. I'm your host, Karen Poirier-Brody. I'm so excited today to have Anna Aspnes as a guest on the show. Anna's a great storyteller with a very contemporary and artsy approach to scrapbook pages. Just a little knowledge of Photoshop or Photoshop elements and one of Anna's templates, and you too can tell your story beautifully. There are so many stories to tell. I'm finally home from recent adventures, only to be off again in a few weeks. I did go up to the Pacific Northwest to visit with friends and relatives in Canada, in Vancouver Island, and also in Seattle, and enjoyed the beautiful part of northern Washington with a wonderful lavender farm. Oh, they smelled great, and such an interesting place. And then off to the opposite corner of the United States, to New Orleans, where we had to wait a couple of days before we could find how we were going to leave on our cruise. Went straight down, dodging hurricanes, and had a beautiful vacation. But there are so many terrible problems with natural disasters. Up in the Pacific Northwest, we encountered a lot of smoke from terrible fires. And we saw someone in Ashland after dinner who was talking to us there on the street and had lived in that area and said it had been 2 months since he'd seen the sun and was feeling so low. And of course, the hurricanes, such terrible devastation. All these natural disasters, and not so natural since arson was involved in some fires. And today, as I record this, more tragedy, as it's the day after the massacre in Las Vegas. It's a lot of sadness. With our communications networks, it's all so immediate and real, and many times so overwhelming. We know a lot about climate, psychology, and genetics, and yet we have such inadequate answers to national disasters, political confrontations, and the onset of psychopathic tendencies. I think we need more attention to science and maybe less passion for some outdated ideas. But most of all, we need more kindness, compassion, and love. I think that's really what the world needs. Thanks so much for joining me today to hear some thoughts on creativity and storytelling from the talented and wonderful Anna Aspnes. Show notes from today's episode are available on the webpage www.acreativeapproachpodcast.com. There you can learn more about Anna, and you'll find the show notes and links from past episodes there too. Please feel free to share your thoughts and comments about the shows with me. And now, let's welcome Anna. Hello, and welcome to A Creative Approach podcast. I am delighted to have as my guest today, Anna Aspnes. Hi, Anna.
Hey, how's everybody?
Hey. Well, doing great here. Of course, we have some lovely California sunshine. Well, almost every day of summer is California sunshine around here. So everything's lovely and doing well. And I just got back from a Lady Gaga concert last night. I must say, I'm functioning on not a lot of sleep because I didn't get to sleep till like 3:30 in the morning.
Yeah, I don't do that anymore. There was a time when I used to do that. Yeah, not so much.
Well, maybe it's all those years I spent as an obstetrician gynecologist.
There you go.
I don't think I've ever really gotten out of the habit of catching sleep where I can. So, Anna, this show's about creativity, and you're a very creative person, and I think the listener would love to hear about your life and what you do, because you do some pretty neat stuff right now. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your designing process and what you're doing exactly?
So basically, I'm obviously from England. I'm living now in the United States and have been for 20 years. I was a military child and married into the United States Air Force. So I found myself traveling around a lot and ended up having my small children overseas. And so I wanted a way to share my family, my growing family, with my family back in the UK. And so we got a digital camera, never had any experience, never had any interest really in taking photos. I just knew that I needed to capture what was happening in my life all the way over in Japan with my family in the UK. And so I started taking these photos, and then I came across a scrapbooking site online when I was pregnant with my first baby over there. And they had all of these really using a software, computer software, photo editing software. And it was very simplistic at the time, but people were using that to combine graphic elements with photos. And I thought, this is perfect. You know, I can tell a story, I can put the photo in there, and I can make some art. I've always been kind of creative. I was told growing up, basically, I wasn't good enough to be an artist or a designer. And so I ended up studying languages, and I have a bachelor's in German instead. And so I never pursued art at all until this point where I wasn't working and I was about to have a baby. So I started kind of documenting the journey with photos, especially as my daughter was born, sharing more photos. And I just got so into this idea of combining art and family and stories together all in one place. And as the industry grew, this was about 15 years ago, my daughter's now, she just started high school today. But as the years have progressed, it's just become more and more sophisticated. My artistry has obviously evolved. And I've kind of carved myself out a kind of a little niche here where it's not really scrapbooking because it's a little bit more elevated than that. I tend to blur the lines between what can be done in paper and what can be done in digital. So I call it digital artistry is what I call it, or photo artistry. It is still scrapbooking in a sense that I'm telling stories with photos, but I also don't always feel the need to add the story to the page. I feel like a story and the art can tell a photo and tell a story in itself.
So dealing with the emotional aspect in the photography and the art.
Yeah. And so over the years, I created these pages and I got more and more requests to make what I was creating available for sale. And so it started off by offering kits and digital products that people could combine with their own photos. And then more recently, in the last few years, I've started creating classes because it's not always intuitive. It always looks so complicated what I do, but it's not really. And so I've now taken on the task of teaching people how to create this type of artistry. So it's super fun.
Yes, and right now, I suppose, is a good place to insert in the show, although we will put in the show notes and, of course, come back to this later, where people can find some of the things that you do as far as like a blog or...
Yeah, I have a website, which is AnnaAspnesDesigns.com, and you can pretty much find everything about me there. I sell my product range at oscraps.com, which is kind of a storefront for digital designers in the digital scrapbooking and artistry industry. So I sell my products there, and I sell my classes on my website, and I have a blog, and you can go meet my team. I have a YouTube channel with lots of free videos. A couple of them, I can send you a link to kind of just an overview of what it looks like. I kind of do a half an hour mini class of showing you how I use my products to put things together, to put a layout together. And then you can also enter your email on my homepage, and I have a free class there too that shows you how to learn to Artplay if you're a complete beginner. Gives you some pointers and where to start.
Oh, great. Well, we'll make sure that we put those links into the show notes so that people will have those.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now you do have what people think of as very arty pages, and you use a lot of techniques that are like, well, you use Photoshop?
I do. I use Photoshop. Most of the techniques I use, though, people assume actually that when they look at my artistry that it's very complex, but most of what I do can be achieved in Photoshop Elements. And it used to be that everybody would use Photoshop Elements. I actually started in Microsoft Digital Image Pro 15 years ago. And there are lots of different types of photo editing software. I believe Creative Memories has one. There's PaintShop Pro that people use, but primarily people tend to use Photoshop Elements or the full version of Photoshop. Recently, when Adobe went to having their software in the cloud, they offer a great deal for their full version of Photoshop with Lightroom, which is really attractive for both professional and amateur photographers because it's $10 a month, which is, considering that the software used to cost over $1,000 for the whole creative suite. It's quite a good deal, I think, just to be able to have that for every month.
Very good deal.
Yeah.
And for, if you want more of the kinds of products, if you happen to be a perpetual student like me, you can get some pretty good student deals on all of the packages.
Yeah, they have student deals, and you can buy their products, separately or together, but it's funny. I always used to have, obviously I've been doing this a long time, 15 years, and it used to be that everybody had Photoshop Elements, but because Adobe have now made it so affordable to have the full version of Photoshop, I'm finding that 2/3 of my customer base actually now uses the full version of Photoshop.
Yeah. So I was never so happy as to learn Photoshop. I have to say, I struggled so much with Photoshop Elements. I think in the earlier versions, it was just somewhat clumsy and awkward, it seemed to me. And I was a paper scrapbooker and I didn't do much digital. And it was only after I took a Photoshop class and then I said, oh, this just seems so much easier. I think once it clues in how to use the software, and it doesn't take long to do that, then, it becomes pretty easy to do stuff in there. The whole getting your head around layers and doing things is not that hard once you try it a few times.
Well, I started with Photoshop Elements version 2, and we're now up to version 15. And I remember back then there were no courses. There was, there was only 6 designers in the industry, and I would bang my head against the wall and just shut it down and get frustrated, and then open it. And eventually, I got through it. But that is exactly the reason that I have started teaching, because people are frustrated, and I want to help them and show them that it doesn't have to be frustrating. So I've been teaching now for I've been teaching longer than 3 years, but I've been teaching on my own site and by myself for about 3 years, and doing it kind of regularly and consistently. That was the word I was looking for. So I've done various classes prior to that, just kind of as a one-off, but I actually launched the AA education side of my business about 3 years ago.
Well, that's good, because then, as people take the classes, they learn the steps, and they can use your products and learning how to put these things together. And you do things that use what I'd say a lot of blended layers and
that's what I'm known for. So in traditional or paper scrapbooking, everything has a hot edge, obviously, because it's tactile and it's put together. You have transparencies, but they're not the same as the pieces that I create are kind of mixed media style pieces. It's very art journalistic in style, in that the edges of the pieces that we put on the page. So in paper scrapbooking, if you think about it, you have a square sheet of paper and you're literally putting one element on top of another. And we do the same thing in Adobe Photoshop, except for because it's a flat screen as opposed to having this 3D, three-dimensional perception, we have a layers panel which allows us to see those elements that we're putting on top of one another. So it's the same thing. We just have to view it differently in Photoshop. And so the pieces that I create have varying degrees of transparency at the edges. So when you drag them and drop them onto your virtual canvas, it gives the impression that one is blending into another. And so this is how you're able to form these pieces in which the photo blends seamlessly with areas of paintwork and texture and color.
Right. It's kind of like a watercolor effect, but with
Yeah.
I think if people use artist and they do photo transfers where you,
Exactly. That's how I would describe it. The people, where you would take a photo and you would use a medium to transfer that photo image onto a canvas, and then you kind of peel away the backing. That's exactly how I would describe it, except for it's not as difficult or as messy in Photoshop. You just literally open, drag, and drop the piece onto your canvas. It's almost like putting a jigsaw puzzle together.
and a little easier to reverse the process and start
Correct.
fresh when on that particular layer.
Yeah, that was one of the appealing things to me. I was a paper scrapbooker for a while, but I lived in a 900 square foot apartment in Japan. And so I'd put my daughter down for a nap, get all my stuff out. And of course, by the time I got it all out, it was time for her to wake up again. And I never got anything done. Whereas you literally just open up your laptop or computer and you just start working. I mean, there's no setup, there's no real cleanup. And then if you make a mistake, there's that handy undo button. So, and you never run out of supplies because you can use the same product over and over again if you want to, changing, the color and the size and all of the different features they have in Adobe Photoshop to modify and change the pieces. You can just have endless fun. Or frustration, whichever way you look at it.
That's true. It could be frustrating. But no, I mean, if you really like to tinker with things like that, which I think I do, makes it a lot more fun. And then, of course, I have a different approach because I have used your products and I love them. And I like some of that. But mine, I tend to be more of a traditional scrapper and make my pages look more like paper. But, and neither one is right or wrong. And I enjoy playing with some of these other options. And you can kind of put those styles together because using your kind of stuff.
Absolutely. I have a couple of girls on my design team who are very much traditional, but they like to incorporate the blended components. And I'm very much a designer who has a no rules approach. I do teach artsy design principles to help people learn how to visually piece things together, piece elements together to make them look pleasing to the eye. So I do that. But I also encourage people to play and not think too much about the process, because I think that we can really get in our way and stop ourselves when we think too much about it, because we basically talk ourselves into the fact that it A, has to turn out a certain way, or B, we tell ourselves we can't do it. And then there's nothing worse than telling yourself you can't do something, because then it's never going to get done. So I'm a big advocate of what I call Artplay, which is basically just allowing the process to unfold, play with the products and play with the tools that are available to you in Photoshop. And the artistry will come as you start putting the pieces together.
I think that's a good point. Like, it doesn't, and there is no real perfection. I mean, it's what you like. And obviously there may be something you're trying to achieve that you might be struggling with, but that's where things like your classes can help people to get their head around how they might be able to do something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I have a course right now that I'm running this year. It's kind of a pilot course, but it was called the Year of Artplay, where I invited students to join me every year. I do a class every month, a video every month, and record myself walking them through creating a layout and some of the pitfalls that I fall into. It's usually not pre-thought out. So I'm basically flying by the seat of my pants. So, I encounter all these problems and I talk people through how I'm going to fix them. And then I have a community and I provide mentorship for those people. And it's astounding to see how much people have grown by just 6 months of the course, So it's really great to see how by sharing my techniques and just my way of doing this, how people are able to then be able to go and create something of themselves. But I also say to people, don't try and do it all my way. Like, I understand you want to create art like I do, but I think a lot of the frustration of some of these artists is that they want to create something exactly like me. And that's the big mistake when you're a creative and you're an artist, is that you need to take my techniques and take my way of doing them, but then make them into your own. So take the pieces that you like and that work for you, and then add in some of the things that you personally enjoy. And that's how you develop a style, as opposed to, because I think people get frustrated when they're trying to be somebody that they're not. So I think that that's important too. I do teach my techniques. I do teach the way I do it, but I also encourage being individual and unique about the way you create your art, and allowing some other pieces to come into my process in order to be able to develop a style that's perfect for you. And it will come, it comes naturally as you start going, okay, I like that piece. I'm going to incorporate that into my process, but maybe I'm going to ditch that, but I'll add this in as well. Then all of a sudden you develop a style that's unique to you and is natural to you as well.
Yeah, because I can't imagine, doing, just sort of switching a style. I mean, there's little things that I just know and love over time from both paper and digital that I like to do. And, I'm always going to be probably using some little photo as an embellishment with a paperclip.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
What you like. That's what you like.
That's some little thing I like.
It's a signature kind of technique that's going to be featured in most of your pages. And so probably if I saw your pages, after a while, I would know that they're yours. It's funny. I have a team of about 12 girls on my design team. And I almost know immediately when I see their work who the layout belongs to, because I know their style now.
Right.
They have a unique style, the way they use their products and the techniques that they like to use. So,
and their color palette, I'm sure.
Color palettes are usually kind of dictated by the products that they use, but it's usually techniques. I have one that really loves to do, really crazy photo effects, and I have one that's very traditional, but incorporates the blended photos and just the blended pieces with the traditional elements. And then I have one that really has a way with using art strokes, which is kind of like pencil or pen scribbles. So I just, as I kind of look through them all, that they all have their different telltale cool signs.
And I think that's true, because there's a couple of designers that, when something flashes page designer, and I'm going, oh, she's done something new. I got to check this out. But you do recognize those things after a while if you're paying attention and you like a particular thing too. Now, how big a role does photography play in your pages and your design work?
You know what? Photoshop is so powerful that you don't have to. So kind of backtrack a little bit. When I first started 15 years ago, I had a digital camera that was 2.1 megapixel Olympus, and that was top of the line back then. Of course, things have advanced a lot in the last 15 years in terms of photography. I think digital photography was fairly new at that point. I ended up getting really into the photography and was really into taking perfect photos. But obviously now we don't tend to lug our cameras around with us. We have the capability in our phones to take fantastic photos that can rival what we can take with a good camera. Obviously, a DSLR, with a good lens, a prime lens is obviously, you're not going to get that with your phones. But it really depends on the angle that you take. I do pages where the photography is obviously going to be the focal point of the page, in which case I'm going to use a photo that I've taken with my DSLR, and I'm going to showcase the bokeh in the background and all of the good stuff. And the story is going to be told by the photo, essentially. But then I have as a memory keeper, I also have other photos of my family where I'm actually telling the story with my iPhone, and I'm not as interested in the photos as I am the story. So the story is kind of it. And so I'm using multiple photos, or I'm using a couple of photos with text in order to tell that story. And then I'm kind of combining it with the artistry to kind of make it all just interesting for me as an artist. But you can take a bad photo, and using tools in Photoshop such as blending modes and levels and curves, which are a way in Photoshop to be able to lighten or darken a photo, increase the contrast. I don't think it's necessary anymore to have a really fantastic camera. I think that you have to come to the table with a goal. You're either documenting your memories, or you're celebrating your photography, or you just want to create some art. And that's going to drive how important your camera or your photos are to you. I would rather have a few crummy photos of a really important moment than I would have no photos at all, so I'll take whatever photo I can get. And then when I bring it into Photoshop, then I basically use the power of Photoshop to improve those photos. But I also like to maintain the integrity of a photo too. I have photos going back to the 1920s, 20s, 30s, about the time that my mother was maybe a bit, I don't even know when photography started, but I've got some really old
late
photos.
1800s.
Yeah, I have some really old photos going back, First World War and kind of maybe just a little bit earlier than that. And when I'm using those photos, I am not that interested in fixing them because I like to showcase the age of those photos. So I tend not to manipulate them. And I hear a lot, the 1970s were a very yellow era in terms of
yes.
Everyone's got these yellow kind of photos. And then
color technology was not that great, and it hasn't always aged well.
And I know a lot of people don't like to scrapbook those photos or to use those photos because, that they're not great photos like we have today. But it doesn't bother me. I mean, I either embrace the fact that they're old and I play off the fact that they're old, or I'll take an old photo and I'll bring it into Photoshop and I'll use Photoshop and make it and then just really kind of manipulate that photo so that it doesn't look old anymore, but you can still see the imagery in the photo. So it really depends on what I want, what the story is I want to tell with that photo. I allow the artistry to become part of the story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And obviously the techniques, even to, if you really can't stand those old photos, the techniques, I mean, you can do some simple 1 or 2 step things that can actually improve those photos greatly. I mean, you can do some really great manipulation and concentrate, but you can also do some very simple things, in Photoshop. The camera raw filter, really, you can just do auto and it makes the camera raw filter in auto is pretty darn easy, to achieve that without even getting into fancier filters and effects and curves and all that. But of course you can.
Yeah. There are filters that remove noise. There are filters that sharpen. You can increase the highlights, the midtones and the shadows in a photo. So you can manipulate them by making them darker or lighter. So there's lots of different, and then you can apply sketch effects and different painting effects. So there's lots of different ways that you can improve the appeal of an older photo if you don't mind losing the integrity of the fact that the photo is from the 1950s or from the 1970s or whatever era that you're working with.
And you can use any of those techniques if you want to get into some really arty effects in contemporary photos.
Correct.
So, yeah.
No rules approach. I think you can do whatever you want.
Right.
It's art. It's art. You really can just play with it and just see what you like. And when you find something you like, do it again and do it again and do it again, and then tweak it a little bit and add something new in to keep it interesting. And that's what I've been doing for the last 15 years.
And then what do you do with your photos? I mean, I think, one thing I really encourage people who do digital art. I mean, you may distribute it digitally, but I really like to see things printed out. Is that?
I do print. I do print. In our house, we actually converted our dining room into a studio because we're a bit more kind of crafty than we are. How many dining rooms, how many places to eat do people we need? So we use our kitchen to eat, even if we have people over, everybody seems to gather in the kitchen anyway. And so I built these shelves where I have these albums, and I have theme-based albums. They don't get added to very often, but for the most part, I have a yearly album system where I have a binder for every year. And so I do what I call my photo inspired project, which is every week I take my my iPhone photos and any photos and images that I have, and I kind of put them either into a double page spread, or I'll do a double page spread for 2 weeks. So it can either cover 1 or 2 weeks depending on how many photos I have. And so I have templates that I use, and I combine the artistry with the photos and just a few words to describe what was happening that week. So I print those layouts out, and then I put my artistry photos in between those pages, so that at the end of the year, I basically have an album with, and sometimes it's 2 albums, depending on how productive I was that particular year. But I have an album for each year. And that seems to work quite well for me, having the flexibility. And I use the We Are Memory Keeper binders, and I print at persnickety prints. And so that gives me the flexibility, because I have children who are 7th grade and 9th grade. So we're busy. We're running here, we're running there. They're not driving yet, but they have plenty of places they need to be and go. But I know in a few years, when they're off at college, I'm going to have a lot more time to go back and maybe fill in some of the blanks. So this allows me then to go back to year 2007 and create a page, and then just slot it into the binder. So that's the way I like to do it. But I know a lot of people who like to do photo books. I tend to reserve photo books for complete projects that I'm not going to add to, like vacations or events,
Right.
that kind of thing.
I me too.
Yeah.
And I don't have quite your kind of organizational system. I think, I'm starting at it much later when children are, growing
Older,
even. And
yeah.
even though I started 15 years ago too, in scrapbooking at least, I had a whole backlog. There's no way I was going to do all these things, and doing things by years didn't make sense. So I kind of modify a Stacy Julian approach about, things about me, things about my husband and I, things about our friends, and things about occasions. And I kind of do my books that way, and I jump around. Sometimes I'll find photos that are years and years old, or even ones, like you said, family history stuff that I'll decide are inspiring me. It's not always something right at the moment. Although sometimes I think doing things in the moment is the easiest, because you really can capture the emotion. You remember that really well. You have to kind of think of the story sometimes when you go back to older photos. I
always tell people to just work on what you're most inspired to do, because you're more likely to stick to it and finish it if you're inspired by it. If you're doing it just because you feel like you should do it, the chances are you're going to fall off the wagon and not do it. And then the other thing that I tell people to stay inspired is, when you feel like you're falling off the edge and you're going, I really don't want to do this anymore, go back and look at that library of memories. I mean, there's nothing more inspiring to me to go up and pick up one of my big albums and look through it and watch my children look through it. I think that's it. When I look at my family, look through them, I go, this isn't a waste of time, and this is going to be really valuable. And I have this kind of pipe dream in my mind that I'm going to be in my 70s or 80s one day, and I'm going to be barely able to see, but I'm going to be sat with my tea, up somewhere, and I'm going to have these memories to look back on, and just really be able to appreciate and remember things that I may otherwise have forgotten. And even now, I mean, I look back 2 years ago and I read things and go, wow, I'd forgotten he'd done that. And I can't believe that they used to say that, so I'm just so glad that I took a few, an hour or so each week to just do a few pages just to capture that time in their lives. And, my son's not as interested. I'm not sure if boys really are. But my daughter, she loves it. She can sit for hours just looking through the different albums. And I know I will appreciate them. So as I get older. So yeah, it's just a really fun thing to do. And like I said, when you go and you see all of the albums and the pages that you've created and you've captured life, you've captured your life, it's quite powerful. And you have this appreciation too, when you see it before your eyes. And even when you look at it, view it through a camera, you see things differently than you kind of otherwise would let things pass you by. We're so busy in today's life, in today's life, that having this really forces me to slow down and just enjoy. It sounds so cliche, but to enjoy the little things. I mean, it really does. It slows me down long enough to be able to go, wow, I'm really lucky. I have this great family and we get to do these great things. And, I don't have everything I want, but that's okay because I have everything I need, and it's a great thing to have, I think, for just peace of mind and
I think
overall well-being and happiness, to know that you, to have that kind of gratitude every day.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that kind of explains maybe to people why we like to scrapbook is capturing those little moments, and so we can remember them and share them. And not everybody's interested in them. I wouldn't, don't think I have to force people to sit down, but I love it when they pick up a book and start looking and are interested. And maybe sometimes some pages I just did them to play. I mean, I scrapbook for myself. It's for my memories and my feelings and my emotions. And if the family likes them, fine, but I'm not, they could end up in the circular file. I don't know. My kids are kind of cynical about that. They said, make sure you put stuff online because I don't know that we have any room to store any of your books. But
oh gosh, yeah.
I don't worry about it too much. For me, it's just something I feel passionate about that I love to do.
I'm the same way. I don't worry about my kids keeping the books or anything. I just think it is really for me. The fact that my daughter gets, joy from it too. And I remember growing up, certainly when, I started having my own children, I had lots of questions for my mom about me at the same age, and she couldn't remember. And so it's going to be really nice to be able to just give her the album and go, here you go. It is all in here, and just maybe revisit that time frame together. And, I get to walk down memory lane. She gets to see through my eyes what it was like, because I don't think we really appreciate what it's like to have children until we have them ourselves. We don't really appreciate what our parents did for us. And so I think that that's the time that it's going to, become helpful. My son is obviously going to end up marrying somebody, I guess, at some point, and maybe she'll be interested in who Luke was,
Yeah.
So.
And it can skip a generation. I mean, it might be your grandchildren or great-grandchildren who really have some idea that they want to know more. I mean, there's so much I do genealogy, and I find that, there's a whole lot of stories that have gotten lost. Luckily, somebody wrote them down, and I've been able to dig some up or been able to construct them from various things that I can find and kind of put them together and go, that explains that.
Yeah,
and,
that's great.
It's really nice to be able to discover that, but I don't know if my parents were disinterested or they were just too busy to get the stories from their parents, and some people just didn't think things were all terribly important. So
well, my grandparents, I mean, I remember my grandparents died when I was in my mid-teens to mid to late teens, I suppose. And I wish that I had asked them more questions, but you don't have it in you at that. You're not interested in that at that age to know these things. It's only until later. I think that whole kind of idea of genealogy and stuff has become more important. My father-in-law has done his side of the family, and my mother has done my side of the family. So that's one of the things I'm actually looking forward to as my kids grow up and they need me less, that I will then be able to take some of that information and combine it with, because they're not really into the art or the photos. So we have the photos, we have the information. It will be my job to kind of collate it together and put it in some sort of creative body of work, I think is going to be my role one day. When
I know, it's finding the time for doing all that.
It is. You always say one day when, but will that day ever come? Because you always find something to do,
Yeah, I've been told I already have enough information for a book, and I say, but what about those little areas of the family that I don't know anything about?
See,
I can't leave them out.
Sometimes you just have to make a start, and just go, I'll figure it out.
Yeah, because but I have a grandparent a grandparent that I know very little other than his parents' names and where they came from. And I really don't know that one little branch of the family at all. And another one, I mean, it goes back to my great grandparents, but even there, I don't know very much about that part of the family. So there's a couple of little branches that I don't know much about, and others, I can trace back to the Middle Ages. I mean, really, it's funny how there's so much documentation about certain people, and other ones there's just not a lot. So but it's an interesting way of discovering a story, and I think that's you're creating stories from the photos you have, your experiences, and documenting those things. And then you were saying you put these in We Are Memory Keepers. Are those 12 by 12 albums?
Yeah, I like 12 by 12, mainly because, I do artistry pages, which have one photo on where the photo is the focus of the page and it's about the art and it's about, like you said, the emotion and the expression. But I like to still print those at 12 by 12 because I think that they are a lot more spectacular when they're large. When you make them smaller, yes, it's cheaper, but they don't have the same impact when they're big. And then, of course, I like to keep things fairly simple in that I mix, and it keeps the album interesting too, because you have a couple of double page spreads of, just multiple photos and kind of just documentation. And then you've got some artistry pages. So I like to have that mix in my albums that kind of keeps me interested more than anything. I tend to be a little bit ADHD and kind of am all over the place, and I lose interest quickly. So I try and organize my albums so that I'm going to remain interested as I look through them, that there's something different on each page, and they kind of zot around in different areas and tell different stories, and just kind of keep delivering surprises as you move through them. So I put them in page protectors. And so, the advantage of that, of course, is that I can go back at any time and add in more and reorganize, and kind of, I do them chronologically, obviously, in yearly albums, but I also don't worry if I miss a month. I don't worry if I miss a month, if I miss a year. I did stop doing my photo inspired project for about 18 months, and I have been, I've caught up on 12 months of it, but I've still got another 6 months to go. And we're just coming off 2 months of summer here. So I have fallen behind again because I've had, 2 teenagers at home and running them around. So I don't worry about it. I just go, at some point I will fill those pages in or I won't. And it doesn't matter to me. It's just, I prefer to look at what I have been able to achieve as opposed to what I haven't. And that keeps the onus positive. It's like, okay, yes, no, I have not scrapbooked every single photo that I own, but nor do I need to. But wow, look at all these albums that I have created. I feel like every page I create is just another piece to the puzzle of my life. It's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Well, I think I look at scrapbooking as something fun. And if I had to scrapbook every page, if I had to do it chronologically, and if I had to get everything in, if I had that kind of sense of obligation, I've seen some people get really stressed out about it. And I'm thinking, I'm not doing this for work. There, if there's some little memory of my child that doesn't get remembered by them, it probably wasn't that important to them, and we don't need to document it. And besides, I think I tend to take my perspective as I'm doing my scrapbook for me, so I take my perspective on things. I'm not trying to do this necessarily for my kids to remember anything. They have their own memories and they can work on their own scrapbooks.
Well, exactly. And it's looking at the lemonade glass half full instead of half empty. I'm kind of constantly trying to fill the glass as opposed to looking at how empty it is. It's just a matter of perspective. I think if you can shift your perspective and move it onto what you have been able to achieve, I think that generally there's less stress involved. And like I said, it's a motivator to go and look what you have been able to do.
Right.
And I schedule time for scrapbooking. Our lives are so busy that I do set time aside so that I can get something done every week, so that, it fills me up and it adds another couple of pages to my album. And I just think that it's just an all-around win. But if, for example, I'm away or I can't fit that time in for a week, I'm not going to stress about it.
Right. I mean,
Yeah.
that makes the most sense to me. And then I was thinking, are you like from a line of storytellers? Or creative, artistic people, or was this part of your life growing up?
Not really, no. I don't know my parents don't know where I get it from, this creativity that I have. I mean, growing up, I was always very creative. Before I could even walk, I would pull myself up at the coffee table and my mom would give me crayons and paper and I would just draw. And so I have been drawing for as long as I've been able to. I always wanted to be an artist and designer. I can remember it being my favorite subject. I was always creating and crafting something. Remember the Barbie dolls? In England, we had Cindy dolls, and I built an entire doll house. And, when I was outside, I would build these intricate little kind of villages that we would play in. And so I was always making something, but I don't know where it came from. My grandma, all of my grandparents were involved in the Second World War. My grandmother was a seamstress on one side. She stitched parachutes during the Second World War. Both my grandfathers served, but my granddad was a bus driver when the war ended, and my other granddad was a greengrocer. And then my grandmother she was crafty. She did decoupage, and she was an assistant in a school. She was a teaching assistant. So I wonder if maybe I got some of it from her, but I was always discouraged. I grew up in an era where, artists there wasn't the same kind of opportunity online and the ability to be able to, for artists, if you did art, you were either a designer or an artist, and they just didn't have the same kind of, I don't know, they weren't looked upon in the same way as they are now. I think that generally pursuing art is a lot more accepted than it was back then. So I was basically told, my parents told me I wasn't good enough to be an artist, even though I wanted to go to art college. And my dad actually did a deal with me where he said, go get your languages, because of course I also grew up in the time where the EU, the EU was just starting, and I'd spent a lot of my childhood living in Germany, and I was really gifted with languages. I picked them up really easily. So I went to university and I studied French and German, and I ended up getting a bachelor's in German language and literature. And so I was almost fluent in German, and my dad had big, grandiose ideas of me working as a translator or something like that in the EU. And then, of course, I met my husband and moved to the States. And I did use my German for a while, but it was really when we moved to Japan, my husband's assignment, that I had Ella, my daughter, who's now 15, that was when I got into the photography, and it was a real creative outlet for me. And people just kept emailing me, asking me, can you make this available? I want to buy this. And so that's how my business started. And back in the day, there were no online stores. I would basically ship all my CDs out from Japan, with all the art. And it was all done by PayPal. And of course, things have changed now. It's so much easier to be able to share the art and make it available. And, every year there's just more opportunities and more things to do. So, no, I grew up in a military environment. My husband retired 2 years ago, and at which point I was 40 years old, and I'd officially spent 40 years in the military as a dependent. So I thoroughly enjoyed the last 2 years not being part of that environment. It's not conducive to artists, because generally it's a very
too much moving around, and
it's a lot of moving. It's a lot of being told what to do, when to do it, which is not really in my nature. I'm a very kind of free spirit. So it was never suited. I was never suited to that kind of environment, never did very well with it. Super sensitive soul. So, the constant leaving and coming back, going to war, it's not easy when you have family who are continually, participating in that kind of activity. But yeah, so I'm a bit of an anomaly really, because my whole family's military. I have my sister, both my brother-in-laws, my husband, my father, both my grandfathers, I think we actually worked it out between us. We have 100 years of service. The only war since the First World War that one of our family members has not participated in was the Korean War. So every other war that we've had since the First World Wars, we've had representation by our family. So yeah, it's really weird that I've ended up this way, but I just kind of followed kind of what I wanted to do. And I also kind of, I had no choice. You know, I was living in Japan, and then I was living in Alaska, raising 2 children. And it wasn't as a foreign national, I'm now a US citizen, but back then as a foreign national, I wasn't able to work. And so it was just a really cool way for me to be able to make a little bit of extra money so I could take my kids to see my parents in England, and to kind of have that creative outlet. And so it just grew into something that's just has been that I'm very grateful for, really. And I feel proud because I feel like I'm making a mark not only in my own life in documenting my own memories for myself and for my family, but I feel like I'm helping other people do it too. And so that's me. I feel like I have purpose. That's my purpose in life, is to help other people do that.
Yeah, I think that's good. You know, there's a couple of things that came to mind that I wanted to ask you about. Some are quick questions. First of all, with your facility for languages, do you speak Japanese?
I do not. And I wanted to learn Japanese, but I was trying to grapple with the idea of having a baby in a foreign country so far away from all of my family that I just didn't have time to learn. I did learn, I learned basic Japanese, a few words. When I went out, I was able to order food, and I was able to kind of start a conversation with the Japanese. So
so you learned some practical language, but you couldn't have a great deep, in-depth discussion.
I think it's polite to always, when you're in a different country, to at least make an effort to know some of their language. I never go to a country and just assume that they're going to speak my language, because to me, I feel that that's rude.
Right.
I'm a guest in their country, and therefore, it's unrealistic to expect me to learn Japanese to go live there. But, to know some basics, I think that it goes a long way in bridging cultural barriers when you can kind of connect on that level.
Yeah, it's nice to know, even when you're going as a tourist, to know how to say hello and
exactly.
Please and thank you, and at least some simple little things like that. I think that's very helpful. And I was thinking also, you were talking about, jumping from one thing to another. That's where digital can be really helpful for you, because you can do a lot of things very quickly. You don't have to wait for the glue to dry.
Exactly. Yeah. And patience is not a strong point for me. It's funny you should say that, because I've really, in the last couple of years, I've really enjoyed painting. But I do struggle with that piece that you put a layer on and then you have to wait for it to dry. By which point I then have a hard time pulling myself back to go and do the next layer, because I'm then onto something else,
Right.
So, patience, that's definitely an issue for me.
Yeah, it's occasionally an issue for me. I think I've addressed that. Although sometimes I can just spend an awful lot of time and keep going back to things. So it varies.
I think you work around it, don't you? You work on multiple things at a time, and then that way you've got kind of a production line going. Yeah. I think that's the way I would work around that, is I would have a production line.
That's probably why I have so many things going on at once.
Yeah. That's how I would do it.
Yeah. And then the thing I think also was interesting, you're helping people with things to do with artistry, and the fact that people said that you weren't really good enough to be an artist. I thought that was really interesting when I went to the Lady Gaga concert last night. She talked about fighting against people saying she wasn't pretty enough, and she wasn't good enough as a singer, and, her early experiences with recording companies and stuff. She said, it was constantly a lot of negative feedback, and it was very discouraging. But she said, when you have a passion for things, you can really, you just have to kind of push at it and keep at it if you really, really have that idea in yourself, and that if you want to do it, keep at it if you really, really think there's a possibility, and believing in yourself. So the idea that you kind of found your artistry, and then now you're really helping other people because they may have a passion for doing something and not quite know how to do it, and help them. I think that's just so important.
Well, yeah, I think that we live in a society that tells us a lot that we can't do something. I was just listening to a podcast this morning while I was walking my dogs about ageism on TED Talks, and it was talking about the fact that, it's not old people that kind of tell themselves, that they're getting old and that that they're too old for this and they're too old for that. It's society. It's society out there. People have decided that old people can't do this. I went on a hike yesterday. I live in Colorado. We went down to Colorado Springs and I hiked this 1 mile up mountain that was it varies from 40 to 68% in gradient. And I saw 60-year-olds doing that. And then I had my mom come and stay out a couple of weeks ago, and she's a bit older. She's 67, but, she's like, oh, I can't do that anymore. And it's because society has told her that at a certain age, then you can't do X, Y, and Z. And, and I see that with people, and it's not just society telling us we can't do stuff. We tell ourselves stories. Right. We have these little chattering voices in our mind. I read this great book. It's called The Untethered Soul, and it talks about quietening that inner chatter that tells us all of this stuff that's just not true. We make up all of these ideas and all of these stories about what we can and can't do, and that and it's just simply not true. We can do anything that we want with a little bit of perseverance, a little bit of determination, a little bit of luck, and then just pure grit. We can achieve anything we want. It may take a long time, but we will get there eventually if you don't give up.
Yeah, and you can tell your mom that she would, it might take her a long time, but she can do that. I felt a little guilty bringing up the rear on a hike the other day in the Redwood Regional Park here, where I was with much younger women, people like your age. And, I was pulling up the rear, not so much on the descent, probably because I felt like I was racing down or falling down the mountain. I was still at the end back of the pack, but not so far back. Going up, though, is a little challenge. But then I get some breathing problems as well as, having some arthritis. So, but I did it. They waited for me a few times, but, I got it done. So,
I waited for my daughter yesterday. And in fact, I was surprised. At one point, I got vertigo and I thought I was going to fall backwards off the mountain. I was bear crawling up these steps. And I was just like thinking, this is just awful. But you know what? I was just like, we can do this. We can do anything we set our minds to. And as you've got these 60, I've seen 80-year-olds up on that hike.
Yeah.
And
I wouldn't recommend it as the first hike or necessarily to do it very quickly.
No, you wouldn't do it. But the idea is that you can do it, And so I really, for my students, I tell them that, yes, you're going to fail. One of my favorite sayings right now is that there's no failure in trying. The failure lies in not making the effort at all. Because every time you try, you learn something new and you inch just a little bit closer to that end goal, But if you don't try, then you'll never achieve what you want to do. But I don't believe that creativity is something that we're born with. I believe it's something that we can develop. And there are people that it comes perhaps more naturally to than others. But I think that everybody has the ability to be creative. And if they can just quieten that little voice inside their heads that's telling them that they can't do it, and that they just put some faith out there and just keep working towards that goal and don't give up, then they can become painters, they can become artists, they can become anything they want to be.
And I always tell people that, what you do can transmit a lot, and that the most famous of all artists are not necessarily those who make pictures that look like everyone else's.
Exactly.
So, the way you capture something might be just the thing that fires a lot of people's imaginations. So I think, that things have to look a certain way, or a portrait looks a certain way, or when you're drawing, it has to look a certain way. You do your best and put your heart into it, and you might come up with something unique and wonderful that people people will really admire, and
exactly.
it'll mean something
different
to you at least, and it might mean
Yeah.
something to others as well. So I think those
Sure.
are good thoughts on creativity. Was there anything else that you wanted to share about creativity with the listener today?
I could talk all day about creativity, but I am sure that you have other things that you want to do with your time. I was just saying I talked over you a little bit, but I think that there's beauty in being different. I think that when everything is the same, it becomes boring. And I think that we all have something creative to give. And it's going to be unique and different, and it may not fit within the box, but that's the joy of creativity, is that you don't have to stay within the lines. It's kind of exciting. It's an adventure.
Well, thank you. I think those are very good words, and I appreciate this chance to talk with you today. It's been really fun.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about. I'm passionate about what I do, and so it's always a pleasure to share it. And, hopefully reach somebody else who might be interested in doing the same thing,
So let's review again where people can find you.
They can find me at Anna Aspnes Designs, and that's A, S as in Simon, P as in Paul, N as in Nicholas, E as in Eric, S as in Simon. It's Norwegian. And you can pretty much find me there. And I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, you name it, I'm there.
And your designs can be found at OScraps.
At oscraps.com in the Anna Aspnes Design Store.
Great. Well, thanks again, Anna, and have a wonderful rest of the day, and lovely to talk with you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of a Creative Approach podcast. I have some news for you. In addition to the podcast being available for subscription on iTunes or Stitcher, episodes will post to YouTube on a Creative Approach podcast channel. Past episodes are also being added to that site. Please visit a Creative Approach podcast on Facebook, where we have a page and a group. Of course, we have the website at www.acreativeapproachpodcast.com, where episodes are linked and where an affiliate page and Patreon tab are available. Thanks to my Patreon members for their support of the show. I'll talk to you again on the next episode, and sign off today with best wishes on your creative approach to life.